Okay. Welcome, colleagues. It's exciting to see that we are finally here tonight for our conversation with Mr. Jim Burke, a person who has made a great impact on many in this profession of education in general and English education specifically. So I'm not going to take the screen too long here from our featured guest, but I will say a few things to contextualize why this conversation is happening, why I felt like this needed to happen. So, first of all, a bit about Jim. He recently completed 35 years as a high school educator. And while doing that work with full engagement, he was also somehow able to write some of the most well regarded books of his generation, including The English Teacher's Companion, Academic Moves for College and Career Readiness, Teaching Better Day by Day, which is a planner, the 6 academic writing assignments, and many more. Also, Jim was invited by W.W. Norton and Company to craft an acclaimed high school English anthology called Uncharted Territory. Back before digital professional learning networks were a thing, Jim created the world's largest English department on the Ning platform. And during its heyday, thousands and thousands of teachers were using that as a place to establish community and share ideas. And I think, as anyone knows Jim, he's incredibly thoughtful, earnest, and truly, I think, can speak to our question tonight, which is, what does it mean to be an English teacher? So, about a month ago, Jim shared with me a manuscript that he was working on for the English Journal that was in response to a question like this. And while I read this retrospective piece that Jim crafted, just enjoying insights in every paragraph about his journey and the different experiences that he's had, the different insights that he's gained into this hard question, this question of what's it mean to be an English teacher. I just thought, in a time like this, 2023, when I think teaching English language arts at the secondary level is perhaps more fraught with tension than it's ever been, who better to talk to us about what it means to be an English teacher than Jim Burke? So, Jim, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you doing, sir?
Fine, Dave. Very nice to be here with you. Coming to you live from San Francisco,
That's
which
right.
this closest we get to summer in San Francisco is about this time of the year. So it's a lovely, what otherwise looks like a spring or even summer day to most of the country. Here today we have the beginning of this nice weather.
Good deal. Good deal. So, Jim, why don't you tell us about the work you've been doing this year? And I'm wondering if you even have done it today. This substitute teaching work. It's hard to keep you out of a classroom, it seems.
Uh, yeah. So it's first of all, it's just really nice to be here. For those that if you're here, you came to hear me, but Dave's the one that's providing the platform, and I just think that Dave's done such a remarkable job of sharing his own wisdom, and I think in a lot of ways that is just the part of my own work that I think I'm most grounded in and proud of is just the finding a way to make my work in the classroom the basis of my own learning. I think what you see in Dave's blogs and his podcast and even inviting me in for something like this and his books, you just see a teacher trying to make sense of what's going on in the classroom. I think what I realized, I never wanted to substitute. I retired in June of 2022, and and I but then you retire, and then there's the question of your medical benefits. And so I realized I had a couple different choices, and one of them was that I can substitute for my medical benefits. And it turns out, maybe I should have anticipated this. It turns out to be a much more meaningful and satisfying experience, because what I realized very, very quickly, and this goes back to my writing and Dave's own experiences, I think, is how much at the end of the day the work is about the kids, and that's where the the source of the energy comes from. And so, I had book project that I was still working on when I retired, and I've got a new one that I'm just beginning to think about now. We can talk about that later. But there's really, without the context of real live kids, sometimes just the most random things, right? I was substituting 2 days ago, and this girl so I'm substituting mostly at the school that I finished my career at middle college, high school. This girl, I said something about whatever she was doing, and she said, apropos of whatever I said, she said, I'm taking a day off from fashion. And like to be around like kids, with like just such random things, and
Oh,
just kind of taps you into, or you walk around and you see some sticker on their laptop, and you're like, "What's that all about?" And they go, "Oh my God, you don't know that band?" And so the way I think about it, in a way that hopefully nobody finds this offensive, is I feel like I get to still be Jane Goodall, hanging out with the chimps that I've spent my life loving, and but I don't have to take notes, and I don't have to write reports. I just get to kind of be
yeah.
with them and still observe, with a little less pressure on myself, and of course nothing to grade. Um, and I am, I have my hand in with it with these guys a little bit, in the sense that I'm working with the seniors who want to meet with me to go over their college essays, and working with that, sitting there and working with those kids, about their college essays. Nothing provides a better window into the challenges of being
Mm.
uh, a teenager these days, and what they've gone through, and what they're hoping to go through, where they're hoping to go. And you're still definitely dealing with kids that are, so what, it's 2023. So, um, last year in 2022, kids, so there's seniors at middle college this year that I still interviewed during COVID to come into the middle college program.
Right.
So we're like, in the hopefully the post, COVID era, but still definitely dealing with the lingering effects, and a lot of the kids, in their college essays have to write about what they experienced, during that, partly by way of sometimes explaining, like this big black hole of grades their sophomore year or something like that. So anyway, I'm not far from it. I think I'm realizing how much I just appreciate kids.
Mm.
They're in a very, there's a big article report that came out today from Harvard about kind of new insights, and kind of articulating the scale and the nature of the mental health challenges for the current generation of adolescents, and it's real.
Well, I mean, speaking of real, I want to explore your journey in this talk. There's a lot of directions that I want to go, but we have a comment here, and I think it's very much touches on this thing I alluded to earlier, and thing that you're alluding to, which is it's a very hard time to be in education. I like and take your point that it's hard for students. There are challenges um, that they're experiencing that I think are new, and some that been around for a generation or so, but we're still learning about. But Jane Wyckoff Kingshot is saying she's working with first and second year English teachers. She's mentoring them, and it's a hard sell to keep them from leaving. So I know that you've probably had conversations with teachers at this stage in the last few years. She's asking for advice that she can give to early career folks.
So I've got a couple things that are kind of fresh off the whatever, about that. So I had this great opportunity to be part of the advisory board for the Wright Center, like RITE in all caps, center at University of California at Irvine. It's basically another name for it is the Center for the Study of Secondary Writing. And so we were having an annual board meeting yesterday, um, looking at the results of some major studies that they've run over the course of the last year, and with writing in middle and high school English and social studies classes. And one of the conversations, so they have this whole, I mean, I guess you call it a curriculum that they developed to try to teach kids all these writing strategies, a big emphasis on English learners, and a whole wide range. This is down in Orange County, and so one of the questions that came up was the difference between the teachers. So you had new teachers and you had more experienced teachers, and there was some data that kind of emerged about the differences between first year teachers, new teachers, and those that have been at it for a while. And I think what it reminded me, I'll use a juggling analogy. I think what it reminded me of is, so Dave's been teaching for a long time. I've been teaching forever. Jane's, I'm sure you've been teaching for a long time as well. That's why you're in that role of mentoring them. And we forget sometimes how adept, how agile we become. A
Mm.
little bit like those, when I was growing up, those Chinese acrobats that have like the poles on their chin with this plate spinning and all this stuff in the air, and we lose track of the number and the scale and the complexity of the mental, emotional, cognitive, existential demands that these days that a new teacher is trying to cope with. And so what we were talking about yesterday was, what are the things that can be done to help, in this case, newer or first year teachers be more successful in these areas. And one of the things that came up is just their feelings of their inability to distinguish between what they do and they don't have to do. Uh, and so sometimes I think a form of leadership is to be aware of all those different demands, um, and kind of keeping an eye on those teachers. So you see them going to get involved in something, and on the one hand, it's not that they shouldn't get involved in that, but on the other hand, it's a form of leadership to say, like, you know what, you would be so awesome in that role as the mock trial coordinator or whatever. I know you're totally into public speaking as an English teacher, but maybe maybe not this year, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe give yourself a chance to say no.
Mm.
As Stephen Covey said, saying no to one thing means saying yes to another, so that the time that you would be spending, whatever, like going to the mock trial competitions and the practices, that's time that you can kind of bring back to yourself. Because, especially as it relates to English teachers, no disrespect to any of the other subject areas, but the volume, the demands for English teachers they're intense. If you're doing the
Yeah.
work with fidelity, right? Like, then we'll talk about
Yeah.
paper load and things like that later. And I do think that's, it might seem counterintuitive, but I think sometimes that we need to play a more active role as mentors and say, you know what, like Regi Routman, who was an early mentor of mine, she did all this great work at the elementary school level, and somewhere she wrote about a young teacher that was talking to her at school, about, her husband wasn't a teacher, and they had tickets to go to the opera that night, but she had all these papers to do, and all this stuff to get ready for the next day, and she was, all in a lather about it. And Regi said, "Go to the opera. Go to the opera. You have to take care of your relationship. You know, the worst thing that'll happen is you'll go and you'll have a great experience, and interesting people are better teachers, right? Like, you'll come in and you'll
Yeah.
share things that you learned from going to the opera or whatever, and nobody's going to get hurt if you don't spend some time with some papers tonight or whatever. Uh, and I
Mm.
think that is something, I'm sure this will be a thread throughout the discussion, but one of my biggest concerns these days is teacher well-being,
Yeah.
um, and it really requires maintenance, down the line. Tonight, maybe we can talk about Don Graves' book, The Energy to Teach, and
Yeah.
a study of his that I participated in that's kind of related to some of this stuff. But I think the role of the mentor to those younger teachers, or to any teacher, um, is sometimes helping them realize not how to do more, but how to do less and do it better. I think more experienced teachers are often more adept at knowing, like, I don't whatever, like, I'll worry about that later, or that's not actually something that's worth my time.
Yeah, and as an early career teacher, this idea of us being leaders by advising younger teachers to say no, to say I get it. You're passionate about this. You love this. You love the kids. I love those things. Those are wonderful. But really think twice before you put this yes in. Like club sponsorship is a common. I mean, it's hard, right? Like I dream of a school where there's just like a moratorium. Your first 3 years, you just can't do those things. Like take it off everyone just as an option. I think that would
I think
that would
that
be
would
a
be so
beautiful
great.
thing. It'd be so good, and it would. I know it would help with teacher longevity. The difficulty, of course, is that in a lot of our schools, if we don't sponsor the club, we get this impression like the club, the activity will die. It won't run without us. And I think this yeah this is there's that sense that you can have as an early career teacher that if I don't do these things, things will not be okay for students. Things won't be good. I Another thing that I was thinking about while you were talking, in talking to these younger career teachers, it's funny, for some reason what came to my mind is that the first time I ever met you in person, I think I was doing a gig out in San Francisco, and I said, hey, can we get breakfast? And graciously you said sure. And I met you at Burlingame High School, which is where you were teaching at the time, and we walked or drove just down the road to a breakfast place. And I remember a student coming up to us while we were having breakfast and talking to Mr. Burke. To me, like, these are the things that it's hard to have faith as an early career teacher who's just so aware of all your shortcomings. The papers that aren't getting graded, the ways that you're messing up, the interstaff politics that you're learning how to navigate and just be okay within. It's hard to trust that there is going to come a day, if I stick to this, where I will be encountering students, or even just remembering students, and just being able to be confident that I was a good teacher to those students. I was a net gain for those young people. Um, I think
One of the
early
things,
career, it's hard to know that.
it's true. It's a really good point, right? Like, you have to get to that distance. Like, even like you're saying with a student like that, um, where that may have been a student that that left with me having no sense that I'd had an impact on that student or something, and then years later that English journal piece ended with an email that I'd gotten when I was working on it from a girl that I taught 10 years before, who just suddenly you know realized some things that she wanted to express her gratitude for. Um, you always know you're running into a former student when you hear this, Mr. Burke. You're like, immediately, you immediately like straighten up. Like, what am I doing? Am I doing? I was at a Giants game one time, and I turned around from the concession. And I had these, like, two of the biggest beers they sold, and they weren't for me, really. Turn around, and here's this freshman girl I was teaching, and her dad. I'm like, hi, Burke.
Just
Um,
2 giant gallons of beer in your hand.
exactly.
It's not what it
Um,
looks like.
but but I've thought a lot about these questions of, like, what do I know at the end that really you know sometimes, as simple as it sounds, makes a huge difference. And I just, even now, when I go around middle college and sub, um, I just realized the truth that relationships are everything, with your
Mm.
students, right? Like, kids, maybe more so than ever, right? Because kids need to feel that there are these people that they can trust, that they can turn to. These conversations that I'm having with kids about their college essays, they're you know, as they often are with those things. There's some pretty intense experiences that they're sharing, and so even in this different context, I'm realizing that if I can't become somebody that they can trust, then they're not going to listen to what I have to say about their writing, or they're not going to be willing to share their stories with me. And I think we ignore that softer side of our work at our peril, because I think it's it's very, with kids anyway, it's very mixed in with our credibility, right?
Yeah. Um, Jim, we have some other good questions coming in. I want to take a minute though to you talked about how the basically interesting teachers tend to be interesting people, and your journey into teaching it wasn't the star student wanting to follow in the footsteps of like the teacher that doted on them. Your
No.
path was different, but one thing that stood out to me in the piece that you've written for English Journal is this idea of I guess discovering your love for books, for reading, for literature, for writing, and also your love for working with young people. So just walk us through how do you go from being this high school student who's probably not being voted by his English teachers as most likely to follow in their footsteps to being an English teacher?
It's you know it's a one of the questions that I've been playing around with a lot, in the years since I retired, um, is how do any of us become a teacher? I think sometimes there's for some there's a discovery that I am, uh, or that's what makes sense. You kind of sneak up on it. For others, I think there have been people, who had an idea in mind from early on that they wanted to be one. Um, you look at, there are a lot of, more people like myself who were terrible students in high school, who go on to become teachers, I think, than we sometimes realize.
Hmm.
Um, I found like a perverted satisfaction. I was on the committee for the AP English framework project, whatever, for about 5 years ago, and I kind of derived a perverted satisfaction of, like, we'd be out to dinner with the high honchos of the college board, who'd probably all taken all the AP classes and things like that, and I would mention that like I'd never taken an AP class. There'd be this moment of like, how did you even get on this committee? Um, so I think what I've come to think is that a strange, very, to me, very fortunate um, thing that happened is I was a terrible student. I got you know I got a D minus in English senior year that was absolutely what we would call a gift D these days, because I played racquetball with my English teacher, and I think he just, I have a very distinct memory of him, telling me one day after class, like, "Do not make me fail you." And
The gentleman's D minus.
I basically, he just couldn't pull the trigger on that F, um, and so I had this experience of not, like, I only remember reading one book in high school for English, and that was, I think, even more like an independent reading book. It was Bless the Beast and the Children, which is, really these days like a kind of a young adult novel. Um, but I think the benefit of that, so I get out of high school, not thriving. I was in the bottom 10% of my graduating class. Um, I came from a non-academic background. My father dropped out of high school in like 10th grade, but you could do that back then. Ironically, got a job with a state printing plant back when the state printed the textbooks for the schools. Uh, so that was interesting. And then I went to a community college where I realized that I knew nothing at all about how to do school, how to take notes. I had whole chapters of textbooks that were literally, I should have read with a little roller, not a highlighter. I had, entire chapters that were highlighted. And so,
Yeah.
you know, and I ended up getting a degree in cognitive psychology, which, focused more on learning, memory and things like this, and actually don't have a degree in English. So, Um, so I think in a really strange way, um, I kind of came through the back door and all these different things, and the struggle of that I think just made me much more aware of how much is involved. I had some student teachers over the years that had been, like all, taken all AP classes and things like that, and they not all of them, but oftentimes they just really couldn't empathize. Like, well, who wouldn't want to go home and read, The Crucible in a night? Like, well, I would, I would not have in high school. I can just tell you that right now. Um, and then, I began to, you know, just kind of wake up to the idea of my own learning and kind of develop, experience some success with my ability to learn. And then with that, I had to learn how to write as well. I had no idea how to do academic writing.
Mm,
Uh, and so in retrospect, it kind of looks like a gauntlet of kind of problems that I had to learn how to solve, and then in the process of solving them, of like learning how to do academic writing and whatnot, I think that was began to cross over into this interest in how to help others do these things for themselves, because it was it was clear, I'd say, from 19 on, like sophomore year in college. I went down to Santa Barbara City College, um, and I had an English teacher there, Mace Perona, uh, who flipped the switch, and you know nothing really was ever the same after that. And so when I think of education, it doesn't grow. It's not so much directly related to like sharing a love of English in the big picture with me. I think it's you know um, I guess like a bit of a conversion experience of like come over to my church, and my church is education,
yeah,
um, because it's made such a profound difference in my own life.
I think I've thought about this idea a lot, that what we are part of the job is, it is conversion, not in the way that the news media gets, paranoid that we're seeking
Right.
to do. But I think the best teachers are absolutely in the business of evangelizing and basically saying that education is good news. Um, Learning
Yeah.
is good news, regardless of which pursuits that you take in life. You said something there too that I think it reminds me of Jane's question at the start, and it's this idea that when you're new, you are uniquely aware of things that, as you gain experience, it's harder to hold an awareness of. You as you gain experience, school becomes. I mean, school is just it's a normal place, right? It's where we've spent the bulk of our years. But for students who are in high school, students who are in middle school, students who are in college, it's not normal. Uh, so I think that this is it's an angle that novice teachers have that maybe is important for us to emphasize as we mentor them. Uh, your your approach to teaching that you've just described, this basically this dawning awareness that the struggles that you were having as a student in college and the successes that you were experiencing, like this was showing you really how to teach it. It was giving you a vision for teaching. I see that same pattern in the books that you've written. It seems to me that when you sat down to write English Teacher's Companion for the first time, that was as much for you as anyone else. That was as much for Jim Burke to clarify his own thinking as it was for anyone else to clarify theirs. Talk to us more about how writing became part of your work. Writing became part of what it meant to you to be a teacher.
Well, you and I have talked about the fact that nobody learns more from either of our books than we do when we're writing them, right?
That's right.
Uh, I think a lot of times people think that you write a book because you have an expertise in that area and you're just going to sit down and like pour it out like concrete. Um, but I think the truth is, you are developing that expertise, that awareness through the process of writing the book, because it's making you more aware of just how much is involved. Tom Newkirk, who's a friend and was the editor of my last book with Heinemann about writing assignments, talks a lot about complicating it for yourself. Like making yourself more aware of the complications. So a book like his phenomenal book, Embarrassment,
Mm-hmm.
the emotional underside of learning. That book remains one of the most important books that I've read in the last 5 years or so. Because there's this thing, that this thread that he's kind of identifying that runs through it all. Um, that only he, like he had to write his way into that, to that discovery, right?
Yeah.
Um, so the question of going back to writing about our work, it actually started, um, before I entirely realized that. I found a couple years back, I was going through some boxes in the garage, and found this notebook that I had no memory of having kept. So my very, very first student was a 14-year-old autistic boy named Ned at a private school out in Santa Barbara. And I worked 40 hours a week, one on one with Ned. He was severely autistic. Um, and his father was Father Mulcahy, if any of you are old MASH fans. Um, and I would, this is like my first year after college, I started this notebook, and I would say, Ned's doing X. I think this is why, like, I would do this at home. I think this is why Ned's doing X. Uh, Tomorrow I'm going to try Y, because I think that will help him with X. And this is why I think that. And then I would come home the next day and say, I did X, I did Y to try to address X, and Z happened. You know, and so basically, when I found that, it was fascinating, because, you know, what if pretty much any of my books said, it's sort of like in the classroom, here's a problem, and okay, why do I think kids are having that problem? I'm going to try something that I think will address that problem. Here's how I'm going to do it. Here's why I think I think it'll address it. Uh, and then you try it, and if it works, then you share it in a book, and put some student examples in there. If it doesn't, or if it just if it works for the same three students who do all of your assignments the way that you wish all the kids did, then I'm not going to put it in the book, because then it's not honest, it's not accurate. Um,
Yeah.
I know we share an interest. I have certain props around me here, so I think we have
Yeah.
a shared interest in the book. They Say, I Say. I just the new. I just wrote the foreword for the new high school edition, with Jennifer Fletcher. Um,
Oh, wow.
I think what going back to writing, my writing and my learning and stuff like that. I think the genesis of the English Teacher's Companion was Lois Bridges, my editor at Heinemann. I'd given her something else that I'd written, and she said, "Oh no, you need to write about what you do in your classroom that helps kids, so the teachers could learn from that." And I didn't know what that would be. And then I had a student teacher who really had been taught nothing about how to design a lesson or a unit. And so, one night I sat down and I kind of just knocked out this probably 15, 20 page thing with some diagrams to try to help her understand, how to develop a lesson and a unit. And that's the pretty much the chapter that's in the first edition of English Teacher's Companion. Um, and I thought, oh, this is kind of what that Lois Bridges woman at Heinemann was asking me to do. So I sent it to her, and she offered me a book contract based on those 20 pages, and that
Yeah.
became that created out. But what I was really trying to do was, what Jerry Graff talks about, is demystifying
Yeah.
what's going on in that performance. And I think, going back to my struggles as a student, I think there's so many things that are mystified, right? That are kind of embedded in these experiments. We say, go home and write a paragraph in which you compare and contrast, Robert Lee and Ulysses Grant, and do we pull back and take a minute to think about the cognitive demands
Mm.
of that task, which maybe we're thinking like, yeah, it'll take them 10 minutes.
Right.
And
Right.
so, if they do take 10 minutes, it's not going to be like a legitimate opportunity for writing instruction. It's going to be something, now a lot of kids would probably just have Chat GPT write that for them. Um,
Yeah.
you know, they take the 10 minutes to catch up on their social media feed, um, and so I think that task of demystifying what's involved um, goes back to my origins as a student who had to learn all those things and not take it for granted that people know what to do. So
Mm.
I model for the kids, whether it's back in the days of the overhead or when I got fancy, I had an LCD projector and I would project things onto the whiteboard and I would annotate it on the whiteboard just to demonstrate for them how to do these things. And then, as often as possible, maybe not the entire thing, but as often as possible, I always try to do some part of my assignments, because
Yeah.
if you can't go into your own assignment, uh, and it's the fancy term for it is empathic design, like to design,
Mm.
kind of with the walk a mile in your student's shoes, um, and there certainly more than one occasion where I would might be writing with my students in class for something that I put together for them, and I would look up and I would say, I'm having a really hard time doing this. Is anybody else,
Yeah.
struggling? And like the whole class would be like, oh my God, thank you. Yeah, it makes no sense. I go, I know, this is ridiculous. So, even, in that seemingly silly little interaction, there's a tremendous amount of, like I'm placing myself in my class alongside my students, like Penny Kittle talks about it, and right beside them.
Yeah.
I'm putting myself in there with them as a learner to be able to, really keep a close eye on the cognitive demands. Where's the engagement coming from? We're trying to keep a fresh eye on the the will to learn. Like kids, if you don't think about these things, you're not gonna evoke in them the you're not gonna light the fire.
Well, and I mean, here you've said two moves that I think can help that early career teacher that we were talking about a bit ago, right? Modeling is just one of those things with nearly infinite potentialities, I think, in a classroom, for demystifying. I love that you've pulled on that, um, that idea that Graf did such a good job speaking to in Clueless in Academe, and then in really like Clueless in Academe, he kind of discusses the problem, but then I say, he says, well, this is a really good way to help that in the area of composition. The the other thing that you said is actually doing the work that you ask of students. How much, how many of us have had these stacks of papers to grade that were basically destined to be terrible because at their core was an assignment that, really, if we just sat down to try it ourselves, we would have realized like, holy cow, I need to rethink this. It reminds me of your book, the one that you mentioned doing with Tom Newkirk, as your editor. And if I my picture for Jim Burke having the light bulb go off on this one is you're in a copy room and you're seeing the different assignments that have kind of come out of the machine, and you just start thinking about the just the design of assignments. So talk about discoveries that you made, maybe some of your top takeaways from having this epiphany at the copy machine, and then, collecting all these different assignments from all around the country and the world,
We,
and
we
then
can talk
having to
about
make.
we can talk about this now because I'm retired and I don't have to worry about my
Yeah,
colleagues.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so uh, that aspect of that that idea for that book was I would say one of the efforts projects that I'm most proud of it and interested in, because I guess it feels the most like some actual kind of research or something like that. Um, I was in the copy room, waiting, at like 5 minutes to 8, like we all often are, um, and and so I'm looking at these stacks of handouts, and I just kind of pick one up at random that happened to be from an English teacher, and like, not that this is reflective of everybody in my English department, but there were, you know, like a lot of grammar mistakes and all sorts of kind of usage errors. Um, and what I realize about handouts, now these things are probably often being created and distributed as Google Doc more digitally, but still, what I realize is, like, when you're going into the copy room and you're making a copy of this thing, this is the secret sauce. This is like the invisible background software to your class, because you're in there. You may have a big $100 textbook or whatever else you might have in your classroom. This is the thing that you created because you thought it would be better, or it was the most appropriate thing for your kids to do, and you're copying it off, and you're going to run back to your classroom and put that in the kids' hands. And that is a very, very, direct reflection of kind of your ethos as a teacher. But then you start looking, like, I would go through, eventually I had, like, I don't know, like a 3 foot stack of assignments from all sorts of different subject areas. um, and you start looking at these things through the cognitive demands that they were placing on things, right? And so then you start looking at the verbs, if you want to kind of get into the standards kind of territory, like, what are the different verbs of analyze or compare and contrast or summarize. um, and there it was clear that sometimes people might have a handout with directions for something that they thought would take students 10 minutes to do. Like, it wasn't a big paper, it was a short writing assignment. And if you look at it, and if you look at each of those verbs as cognitive processes, right? This kind of goes into, academic moves, a book that I wrote
Yeah.
for Corwin. And you start realizing, like, we had a 4 hour discussion one time at the AP English committee, which was fascinating, but it probably sounds like a nightmare to some people. We had a 4 hour discussion about the difference between the word analyze and evaluate one time, because we were trying
Oh,
to, get the words just right for this thing. And, you crawl deep down into the machinery of these things, not as words, but as cognitive processes, right? And then, so you're teaching social studies, you tell kids to go home and, analyze the causes and consequences of, whatever, World War I, or some moment in it. That's a massive cognitive demand. And if kids don't know how to do that, or if they don't know what that looks like, so you get into that pulling back and saying, am I sending kids home with tasks that I want them to do that already make much more significant demands on them as readers? Like, we're not even getting to the writing part yet.
mm-hmm.
Like, are they? And I'm thinking that this is a 10-minute homework assignment for tonight. Um, but really, what I've done is I've structured something that, you know we could spend the whole week trying to work on. If I So there's always that issue of, like, of all the different things that I could literally try to, legitimately try to teach in this assignment. Um, like, which of them do I want to accept responsibility for and then actively teach?
Mm.
And I think a good example are a lot of the kinds of moves, in things like they say, I say. Like, I heard a biology teacher once. We were having a meeting after school, and she was kind of lamenting the fact that her kids, just had no idea how to write. And I said, well, what are you having them write? And she says, oh my God, like today, they had to do these experiments, and at the end of their notebook, they're supposed to write, to compare the results of the two, labs that they did, or something like that. And I said, well, that's a really, when you get down to it, as a writing performance, it's a really complex act. I said, on my board, if I was doing something like that, I would at least write, X, X differs from Y in, in the area of Z, which is important because of A and B. Uh, so just even to sketch it out kind of in those algebraic terms, so they know the kinds of moves they need to make. You could go to the next level and provide, like, demonstrate with a model. Uh, and she's like, oh my God, I never thought about that, because she's a
Right.
super smart biology teacher
Right.
who just thinks so immediately and fluently and reflexively in those terms that it doesn't even occur to her that nobody would know how to do that. And so I think, going back to your comment earlier, Dave, about the importance of examples. I think we always have a range of kids in our classes. Like, one of the challenges with models is, if you well, I'll illustrate with an example. So I wanted to give my students one year a sample paper to write. It was about the sample was about Hamlet, uh, and the model began something like: determined, period; tragic, period; confused, period; Hamlet was many things, right? And so I give them this example, and what do I get? I get like 79 papers that all begin something, period; something,
All
period;
right.
something, period. It's like, okay, so you've got to give kids a range of, to kind of show them there's a range of ways to write about
Right.
this, so that you don't get papers that are all kind of echoes of each other.
Yeah.
Um, and I think now, I don't know what you're dealing with. I'd like to hear, but I think now there's this whole new aspect of crafting these assignments so that they can't go home and outsource it
Yeah.
to Chat GPT, right? What are you seeing with that in your classes,
Well,
or
I
how are you?
mean, so this is an area that I am very much not a thought leader on. Um, I have taken the pragmatic approach of using much more on-demand writing in
Mhm.
my classroom. And just for folks not familiar, I've been for a few years now just teaching history classes, so that's a bit more possible than if I had English courses on my agenda this year. I yeah I you said the daily double word there a bit ago, and I thought, you know Chat GPT, Jim, what are your thoughts? Uh, because uh, this is a I yeah it's not an area that I've really figured out. Like, as soon as it goes home, I just feel like I really at this point don't have many tools in my toolbox, so I'm just relying on much more on-demand writing, teaching students how to write different types of things, short answer questions, longer essay questions,
Right.
but mostly in class while we're there together, so that I can see what's happening and catch, because my hunch is that if a student is wanting to do well in their writing so that they can grow as a writer and develop as a thinker, in other words, they're probably motivated, they're still going to be heavily tempted by using a tool like ChatGPT when the cognitive demand does become too high,
Right.
like you've been talking about. So I think, previously the reaction to a task that I'm having to do on my own where the cognitive demand is too high is I'm gonna, I may seek dishonest solutions to my problem, or I may just check out and say, I didn't get it done,
I
Mr.
like that.
Stewart.
Seek dishonest solutions to my problem. I like
I
the way.
mean, it's not like there never were dishonest
Sure.
solutions. This
Sure.
this one though is just incredibly more convenient and harder to detect. Um,
Well, there's two
so
pieces about that I am particularly interested in and concerned about. One is going back to the very first question about young teachers. I think my biggest concern, I think, with Chat GPT is, there's a couple, but one of them is so much of my own. If you look at that book about writing assignments, right? Like my writing assignments are things that I put a tremendous amount of thought into, and I find it goes all the way back to my having a degree in cognitive psychology and learning processes and all these things. And I am being very deliberate about the kinds of thinking that I want the kids to be using or developing. where that stands in relation to the previous assignment, and doing, the crafting of those assignments um, is a profoundly validating, meaningful experience for me, and for other teachers, when they're doing that work. And uh, so when if people felt like, what, all my kids are just going to go home, and whatever I ask them to do, they're just gonna throw it into Chat GPT, like throwing some dirty clothes into the washing machine, and hitting 10 minutes cycle, and then going off and checking their Discord stream, uh, or playing a little video game, and then coming back and taking the Chat GPT laundry out, and then submitting it. In that scenario, my deepest concern um, is actually about the existential um, meaning, or experience of the teacher, because so much of my identity and my meaning and my own learning comes from the process of, okay, what do I want kids to learn, what do I want them to know, how can I best design an experience or a process or an assignment that's going to develop those capacities, and then what do I need to do to teach them. And if you go through all that work, and then if you found yourself with one assignment after another where you just saw, like, oh my god, like none of these kids did it, that to me is one of the greater concerns about people staying in the profession, because it completely disregards the integrity of our craft. The other
Right.
side of it, that and we talked about this the other night, I think the other side of that, which is related but different, is you know like, how did I become the teacher that I am? How did Dave Stewart become the teacher that he is? Well, you look at every assignment you're putting together, even down to the smallest decisions, as an opportunity to really crawl into those processes of learning, and ask yourself, like, okay, what's the if I'm a history teacher, my wife was a social studies teacher, should I do a simulation? Should we do it? Should we do a debate? Should we write a paper? Maybe sequence these things, into something that culminates in the paper. Who knows? Or if I'm doing a test, what are the thinking moves that I want to test? Not just this factual knowledge. Um, and so, digging into that process is, I think, probably hands down the most significant means by which I've learned what I've learned. Right? If you're just doing
Mm.
so I got into fly fishing about 6 years ago, which turns out to be a
Yes.
really interesting experience for learning and teaching, because suddenly I'm doing something that I know nothing about. I don't have the vocabulary for it. I don't know the skills, the actions. So anyway, so I was on this fly fishing trip, and this young teacher um, came to the camp out, and was brand new to fly fishing, and threw himself down, and grabbed a beer and started talking about his day at school that day. Um, and so I didn't tell him, what I did, but I said, "Oh, you're an English teacher." I said, "What are you teaching?" And he said, "This short story, The Lottery." And I said, "Oh." He said, "So do you like anything going on with Chat GPT?" He goes, "Oh man, I love Chat GPT." He says, I'm teaching this story, and the other night I went on Chat GPT and I just said, create me a 10-question quiz about the lottery.
Mm.
Boom. A minute later, I've got a quiz, and give it to the kids the next day, over and done with. And you know, so I'm not judging him, but what really you know troubled me about that was that, like, that example of an occasion of creating. So how do I want kids to read this short story? Shirley Jackson, by the way, as a side note, went to Burlingame High School long ago.
Wow.
um, the lottery is clearly about the culture in Burlingame High School where I took. um, and um, so he's found in ChatGPT as a teacher and I totally get it. We're all looking for ways to save time, but he's found this mechanism that he can outsource creating a quiz to, and I look at that as I would have spent. I'm just kind of making this up, but I would have spent a half an hour to 2 hours maybe to if it was kind of new work in my class to create that quiz because I would have seen that as an opportunity to dig into and learn and really think about that aspect of the work and found
Right.
that totally fascinating and been motivated to do it for my own learning. And so the idea that that a teacher like that could go through the whole year and just not think about how to assess, what to assess. If I held up his quiz, could he go through and explain what do you besides the facts of like who threw the first rock?
Right.
You know,
What
uh,
what is your intention with each of these questions?
yeah. What's the pedagogy behind it?
Right.
Uh, that that thinking about what we want kids to learn and how best to teach it. Um, that is not I guess the way to say it would be if things went that direction, then none of us would need to be. My mom could walk into class tomorrow at 84 and say, "Sorry to your age online, mom." Uh, my mom could walk into class tomorrow and just tell ChatGPT to create a test about a story that she would not have even theoretically have to have read.
Right. Yeah. There is I think these twin dangers are important and often get left out of the conversation of the teacher demoralization aspect of putting together assignments with great care that end up getting spit out by a machine, but also this potential future where you can outsource a lot of the tasks that have helped us to arrive at a level of understanding student learning that had we just been given a set of tests or quizzes to give, we would not have gained. You mentioned a few times social studies, and we've got the curator of the English Teacher Weekly here, Drew Campbell, asking
Oh
us a
wow,
question. Yeah,
I
uh,
like that guy's work a lot.
yeah, Drew. Both Jim and I have both had conversations offline about the enjoyment we get from your newsletter. So keep doing that. But
Well,
Drew's,
Drew mentioned you in his latest
I
newsletter.
I know, I know, and I've seen likewise. So yes, I emailed Drew saying thank you for taking my work and teaching me more of what I was getting at there. So Drew asks, Dave, Jim, I'd be curious to know what relationship you think the English class should have to the other humanities courses. And Jim, you and I have talked about conversations and collaborations that you had at middle college, and but just in general, what are your thoughts here as you look at Drew's question? Um,
So I love the question. Obviously, I believe in collaborating with social studies because I married a social studies teacher. Uh, when I started at Burlingame High School in 1992, there was this phenomenal program in the freshman honors program where if kids were in freshman honors English, then they were automatically placed in um, freshman honors social studies, whatever it was called. Um, and the teacher was a guy named Frank Furpa, who I just absolutely loved and respected. Uh, and Frank had this textbook that he was so devoted to. It was all primary sources. It was called Tradition and Change. He was so like committed. This is, you have to remember, this is in like the pre-internet era when somebody else, today would maybe toss it and create their own, with a bunch of digital text or something. But that was a different time. And Frank actually got permission. He's such a moral, upstanding guy. Um, no going straight to the copy machine for Frank. Frank got permission to photocopy basically the whole book because they were falling apart, and then get it bound. And they were all primary sources, and they were organized as case studies. So there was like a case study around apartheid, and then or certain kind of social structure, and then apartheid in South Africa would be the kind of the case study, and there was some other, case study in, whatever it was, like totalitarian, governance and something. And so in his class, he might be teaching what was going on in South Africa, and in my class, we would be reading "Cry the Beloved Country," um, and cross fertilizing those conversations. We were actually teaching our South Africa unit when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. So
Oh, wow.
it was a great moment when history rhymed, as Seamus Heaney says. Um, but it was also really interesting because, I wish, I wish I'd kept, better track of some of these things, because it was really the beginning of the internet, but not the internet as we know it. So there were these things back then called bulletin boards, which probably still exist in some form, um, but they had these weird long addresses, and then it would end with like SA, meaning South Africa, and you would go on, you would click on that, and you would go online, and you would just see this big long string of, hot link posts. So it was all text based. Um, so my students and I, like, I would bring a modem and my laptop, which probably weighed 20 pounds, into my class, and I would hack into the school telephone system, and the kids would get into groups, and they would brainstorm questions that they wanted people in South Africa, or at least people who were from South Africa, to respond to. And the internet was so new back then that, like, somebody might post a question like, what's it like, in this situation, and they would just post it onto the bulletin board, and people would respond with, like, a page or multiple pages of response, because it was a novel thing. Like, years, probably 5 years later, like, oh, give me a break. I'm not gonna, with email and
Sure.
all this. And so and then we would have conversations about, how representative is this, right? These are obviously only people that have computers, the vast majority, if not all of whom were probably in that context going to be white, et cetera, et
Hmm.
cetera. But and then when we would study India and the caste system, we would post, similar stuff online, and like, what does caste look like? These are some questions that we have. So, so it was a very, very rich interaction. And Frank and I really, collaboration is tricky. We hired other people into the department that were supposed to teach, a couple of those English classes. Um, and if you're not into it, it's kind of a hard thing to do if you're not genuinely into it. So Frank and I
Yeah.
just had a rich collaboration. Obviously, if you and I were, those two teachers, like, we would just, rip it up, um, and it would culminate in the fourth quarter with this thing that, like, there's some stuff about this in English Teacher's Companion, where they didn't study a country, but they studied, I guess you'd call it more like sociology, like the social studies of
Right.
sociology and anthropology. And so they would kind of do all these different readings, and then we would read Lord of the Flies and put William Golding on trial for crimes against humanity because of some comments that he'd made about human nature,
Mm.
and basically, put him on trial for libel, and it was a very involved production, right? We'd set up a whole court situation in the library, take over the library for a week. Uh, Kids, some kids could choose their role, so some kids would be lawyers. Um, Other kids could be any number of people from history. So somebody could choose to be Anne Frank. Somebody else could
Mm.
choose to be Hitler. They had to do research into these. Somebody could be, Martin Luther King, who, really whoever they wanted to be, but they had to do a lot of really, really deep research and then come into the trial and speak in character
Mm.
with, like, with a depth of knowledge. And so, and then after that, they would write a paper that would kind of synthesize those things. So that was, to me, that freshman year was the richest of collaborations. At middle college, my last couple of years, I was sharing a room with a social studies teacher, Jason Letke, who's, great guy, really did interesting stuff. And I was teaching junior. I was teaching, what would you call it, American Lit, I guess, junior
Okay.
English. Um, and he was teaching U.S. history in the same room, and the walls were, typically be covered with all these posters and things like that that his kids were working on. And so Jason and I, just because of the structure of the school, didn't like directly collaborate, but I tried to kind of match, kind of the
Yeah.
certain aspects, um, and would very often like just draw straight off the walls, in a kind of fluid kind of way. Like, well, look at the walls and like find an example on the walls for Mr. Letke's class that you think relates to this idea that we're talking here about, American identity or something like that. So I think, um, I wish that the collaboration, specifically between social studies and English teachers, um, was more common, I guess,
Yeah.
than it often is. I know it's a huge challenge for social studies teachers, you know, to the extent that they take that approach of, like my wife would say, like, oh, it was a good year. I got all the way up through the Korean War, or
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that.
Right. Right.
So there's
It's
always that challenge. Who knows what social studies teachers in 100 years are going to be dealing with? They're still going to be saying
well.
they got a Korean War.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. The mark will maybe be Eisenhower or something. Hopefully not. This idea that you've touched on though of um, the world converging on your lesson plans, I think it reminds me of something else I want to touch with you on that we've talked about, and it's just this idea of the ELA classroom. I think especially history too, being under such a microscope, a public microscope nowadays, and there being so much fear, anxiety amongst the public about I don't hear much. I don't hear of many school board meetings that get moved to the gymnasium because of what's being taught in biology or phys ed. But I've been to many schools and talked with many people who you know board meetings can become really focused on the content of the English language arts curriculum, the content of social studies. So knowing that we're going to have teachers listening who hope to teach, hope to teach full careers, hope to get to 35 years and be able to have this look back on this full career. What's your advice for folks navigating this world in which, man, if you pick a current event to try to bring into your class, um, you you are walking a tightrope. You could potentially be under fire tomorrow if you make a misstep or the wrong individual catches hold of it on social media. So yeah, I guess what's your advice to ELA teachers navigating a time where the work that we do is, regardless of our intentions, can be very politically charged and volatile.
Only teach grammar and vocabulary and spelling.
There we go. All right, next question.
Um, well, what's a big story in the paper today that relates to exactly what you're asking in certain ways? A big story in the paper today, aside from the things going on in the Middle East, um, is Scholastic. Scholastic is a big article. I think it's on the front page of the New York Times today. Scholastic, you know, they're a business, they're a corporation. Um, they've got their profit margin or whatever to try to answer to. People have different ways of thinking about that kind of stuff, but that's what businesses do. And I've never understood how Scholastic wheedled their way into America's classrooms, with the book fair kind of thing. I mean,
Right.
it it's always struck me as like, how did you guys even get to do that?
Yeah.
Uh, and then keep getting to do it. So they made some decisions. I can't remember the exact titles, but they basically made some decisions about books to withdraw from those book fairs. I think is the idea. Books that are gathering a little more heat and light, um, to try to make them a little safer, which of course people immediately noticed and then came after them, for those concerns. And so, the between experiences that I've had, working with textbooks, whether it's the Norton book or like a 612, McDougall-Attell textbook series, you make these decisions at a point in time based on what you think is engaging, what you think is appropriate, for the grade level, for the classes, um, and then when you bring that into the classroom, these days the context of community standards, the concept of community standards is, it's very complicated. On some level,
Yeah.
um, people need to, um, test that they need to know the waters of the town in which they teach, the district in which they teach, um, and understand. I mean, I completely accept that some people might see it very differently, but, um, you know, these are the people that hired you. They're the district that you work for, uh, and, um, if you become too oppositional, uh, then the board of the district is simply going to see you as being at odds with, the norms of the community,
Right.
as the district and the school and the board are meant to represent them, and then you'll be asked to leave. And so I think, do I support that? No, but that's what they're in a position to be able to do.
Right.
Um, and so I think it's, you have issues around what you teach, right? So do you bring in, a photocopy of something, or do you have them go on, just to some website, to look at something? Do you, bring in a particular book? Um, and trouble can come from as small as a single word,
Yeah, it can.
in certain books,
It can.
and so, and then, again, like, know your district and know your community. So I was doing some work at a conference down in Monterey, down on the coast in California, a couple weeks ago, and you would hear people talking in their workshops about, like, giving presentations and saying, "Well, I come from a really liberal district where, you know it I have complete freedom to teach Tommy Orange is there, and not have any issues." But there are other districts where you would never even get money to buy that book,
Right.
let alone permission to teach it. Um, and so I think, there's got to be much more, um, just in terms of people's kind of, in some cases, safety and credibility and security in their job, to know when, um, it's like bowling, where you have that laser red line there, that you don't want to go past. And if you go past it, then know what you're doing, and simply understand that you're,
Yeah.
you know potentially putting yourself in a difficult situation. Um, I think there's some places in the country, certain states, maybe down in the far southeast corner, for example, um, where and Texas as well. I've done work with all sorts of wonderful places in Texas over the years, but the climate, around the titles people are teaching, the topics that they bring into their classes, the techniques, that they want to use, some of the tasks that they want to have kids do. These four T's, that as I think about them, are they're fraught. Uh,
Yeah.
so I'm a big believer in it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. But you know, I know what I can get away with. Like, if you're going back to the new teacher question, if you're a new teacher and you're not tenured,
Yeah.
like, don't assume that things are just going to be all hunky dory
Right.
um, if you come in with something. And I feel like it's, you know, I hate this, but the nature of the times are that it's what could have been okay yesterday when you made that photocopy. Today, when you bring it into the class, you know, uh,
That's right.
you know,
It may.
things could change for any number of reasons, and then you're in a situation. So I think it's made. Would I be particularly worried? I wouldn't. Uh, but that's the, I guess you could call it the privilege of, you know, my years and my reputation in the
Right.
district. Um, being comfortable. Like if somebody says I don't want my kid reading that story, saying totally totally fine. Here's an alternative. Things like that.
Yeah.
I will
Yeah.
say,
These.
I have these images of during COVID when I was teaching. We had to teach for an entire year online
Man.
for writer readings at my school, and so I had this one girl, wonderful girl, who was from a really, really conservative family, and she would always be sitting at the kitchen table, on Zoom, and her grandmother would just be like, conveniently baking cookies in the background or something. And the whole year, I just kept waiting for her grandmother to whip around, with her spatula in her hand and come leaning against my screen and say, "What are you teaching my granddaughter?" Thankfully, that never happened. Um, but uh, as somebody who was the legislative liaison for English teachers in California for a number of years, as somebody who like received the NCTE award for freedom of speech,
Sure.
um, that kind of stuff. Who believes in these things very strongly. Um, it's a different time now, in large part because of the internet. The ability of people to, like, I'm just sure, I don't know what they are, but I'm sure they're just bulletin boards or websites where somebody can post, a title that my kid is being asked to read, and there'd be plenty of people there to jump in and tell you, all the ways in which that's awful,
Right.
um, and give you 10 different strategies to go after the teacher.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
I
there's
mean, I think,
where it's been dangerous for teachers.
and you're speaking to, I think, really, really good insights for ascertaining the danger, for weighing decisions, with texts that you bring in, tasks that you ask students to complete. Um, Really, to me, what you're describing is understand your context and understand the potential consequences. Um, and I think that latter part certainly has become a thing that you should think about much more now than maybe even 5 years ago. The potential consequences, because they can be getting pilloried on social media. They can be getting underneath the microscope of a school board, which I never would have dreamed of having
Right.
potentially the school board discussing my individual class.
Well,
But
so let's without going down the rabbit hole of it.
yeah,
Let's just take a second, between the two of us as a social studies teacher and and an English teacher, and just take the overwhelming example of what's going on in Israel and
all
Palestine right
right,
now, and it's so large. I was sitting with a girl 2 days ago, who I was mostly kind of meeting for the first time at middle college to talk about her college essays, and it came up that her family's Palestinian, and she, sitting there together, she just, she's looks like her biggest concern at the moment is whether she's going to get to work on time that day. Like there was
yeah,
nothing in a state of distress for her,
hmm,
um, but just to hear her say that, and realize, like it's in our classes,
Yeah. Yeah.
in some way, and the dilemma some people are going to feel like I have to address this. I everything about me
Right.
as a teacher. I'm not saying for myself, but I'm sure there have to be some teachers saying like I would be failing in my responsibilities if I didn't touch on this, and if there's some consequence to that, then you know so be it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then the decisions about how are you going to tell? I mean, can you bring it um, in a whatever you want to call it, a balanced or somehow you know pedagogical way without turning your class into um, whatever a terrible situation of emotions.
Right.
Um, in over 35 years, I taught. I was teaching during the first Gulf War. School I was teaching at, Castro Valley, great school, had a lot of problems with race. As an aside, Rachel Maddow was the valedictorian my first year teaching there, so I watched her give
Wow.
the graduation speech. That was interesting. Um, we didn't know she was going to become Rachel Maddow, but if you
Right.
look back on her speech, uh, she stands up in front of the whole school at the football stadium and she says, "Well, here's the speech that Mrs. Spate, the principal, approved, and that's not the one." And she tears it and takes one out of her back pocket and says, "And this is the one that I'll be giving." So it's kind of interesting to think like that was probably the birth of who she would become.
Right.
Um, but at that school, you know, um, there were a lot of hard issues there, and
Yeah.
so it's how we handle these things. Like I taught Exit West by Mohsen Hamid my last year. Love that book. Um, if you were teaching that book right now, it would probably be impossible. Like I started teaching it actually the week that the war in Ukraine started,
Okay.
and we would go online and follow because Exit West is just all about refugees fleeing this kind of unnamed country that you know would map onto Israel and Palestine right now. It mapped onto Afghanistan and Ukraine when I started teaching it, and we would start class each day by looking at basically the body count, no, the migration count of people fleeing
Right.
Ukraine, and kind of started at like number one, and so to bring that into the classroom, um, it fit, it was appropriate, like there was completely defensible, there was no sides to it. And not a lot of Russian sympathizers at my school, um,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a really rich kind of curriculum encounter uh, with 9/11. When I was teaching and 9/11 happened, I'll always remember the day that I came into my class that started. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so many emotions. They're so raw, and so we teach within these constraints. Like at Burlingame for years, I had 51-minute classes. Um, why 51? Because they wanted to create an extra period, so they cut us from 58 down to 50, and we complained that that wasn't enough time, and so 51. That's what you call district office wisdom, and still had all that we needed to accomplish within those 51 minutes. Uh, and so I think when things start getting, we start turning our curriculum over to, kind of forums on issues that can just really run over with emotions. The challenge is where's the instruction um,
Right.
in that. Um,
Yeah. I mean, you're reminding me of, I think, a really wise remark that Matthew Kay makes in his book Not Light but Fire: How to Have uh, Meaningful, Productive Race Conversations in the Classroom. And this would be a top recommendation for me for folks who are wrestling with these questions of what is my responsibility for bringing in things like the Middle Eastern conflict right now. Um, you know, Kay has a great piece of advice, and he basically says, you know, just because something happened on the news yesterday doesn't mean that a few days of thinking about it and thinking about how best to approach it in the class will make it less relevant.
Right, right.
So he basically cautions against, just,
Like being reactive.
yeah. He really cautions against being reactive and falling prey to this thought that you can have of, well, I have to sideline everything right now and address this. And he does it for many of the reasons that you've said. Is, you know, my job is first and foremost as a teacher, as an educator, creating these productive learning experiences. Um, Gosh, if it's breaking news stuff, especially stuff that's breaking news that's very emotionally charged, um, then I need to really think about this before I facilitate a discussion, or before we do some looking at various news articles, or however you want to approach it. But I just think that is really good advice. It's really good advice to think about these things a little bit extra, design these experiences with extra care. Um,
It also goes back to that comment I made earlier, though, about the relationships with your kids are everything.
yeah.
Because if you've got to know your kid. You got to
Yes.
know, like, the kids. It is not going to be okay to pretend like this didn't even happen. So even if that means coming and saying, like, I want to acknowledge it. Today's not the day,
Right. Right.
but I that happened. So I'll give you an amusing anecdote about this, and then a more serious, important point, I think, that ties a lot of what we're talking about together. Probably the class that I lost the most entirely, and the most suddenly, and had no hope of regaining it, was a long time ago when Tupac Shakur was killed. Um, I made some comment in class that basically implied, because it was true, that Tupac, had was dead, and my entire class erupted in impassioned arguments that he was not, and I've never had a less of a chance of reclaiming focus.
You were
You
dead
know,
to them.
they would have spent less passion and argument arguing that whether Jesus was dead, than than,
Right.
than that day. And there was some point where I just really, oh my God, whatever. Like, the serious response that it goes back a bit to the social studies, English, probably even maybe some other classes. Um, like California is implementing a law starting next year, I believe it is, for a required, which has been a hot topic, required class for ethnic studies, or an ethnic studies requirement. And so they've provided a range of ways to be able to satisfy that in schools. So I was doing a workshop for Jeff Wilhelm out in Idaho summer before last, at his summer writing project. And Idaho, I did not know, I didn't realize how intensely conservative Idaho was. I accepted the invitation so I could just go out to Idaho and go fly fishing. But um,
Obviously.
and um, and so the summer writing project that Jeff was running actually had a mandate as part of their funding, that they had to, the teachers, and they could be, I think, elementary up through high school. Um, they had to develop assignments that were about, what was that phrase? They were about contended contended issues. Uh,
Mm.
and it was intentionally broad, right? So Idaho has a lot of indigenous groups. They've got other issues with race and things like that. So there was no one specific thing, but they had to develop a unit um, around what basically was, um, you know, a, a point of contention, right, where people
Sure.
had strong feelings about that's wrong or that's not important. Um, and it was a very interesting. Like I came at the end of the week. I was there, for the last couple of days, but my talk was on the last day, and my what I tried to do was to have them look at what it was they were creating, um, through. I created this like four square diagram, and I said, okay, I want you to you've created this assignment, this point of contention, um, and I want you to in one quarter is the parents, in one quarter are your fellow teachers, in one quarter is the students, and one quarter is the community.
Sure.
And I want you to put your basically your unit title or whatever, the point of contention, in the middle, and I want you to reflect on and discuss with each other, um, what the point of contention is as you see it, and then how each of these four groups would see and respond to what it was that you're asking their kids to
Hmm.
learn and to do. And one of the things that came out of that for me was, um, and I totally get it. Um, I would say if you had like a circle around the topic in the middle that was bright red, meaning like the zone of fire for contention, and then each circle kind of got a little paler, then they were getting, then most of them, and again, I understand most of them, I would say, were getting into some pretty serious shades of, at best, light pink, um, because to wade so directly into territory. But that was the mission. Like the State Department of Ed was saying, like, we want you to design these experiences and these conversations that we need to have in the state, and
Hmm.
through your assignments, you know help kids learn how to enter into and have those conversations about those issues. Um, and so, partly in light of what we're talking about, whether it's like English social studies collaboration or the politics of things, the the need to feel safe, uh, you know, I was this meeting I was in yesterday, with the Center for the Study of Writing, right? So they're sharing all this great work, uh, and there was a unit that they were looking at as an example, and I thought it was just phenomenal work. Um, the whole unit, at least that we were looking at, was organized around Cesar Chavez. So I can list 35 different reasons why Cesar Chavez is worthy of study. In part because he's from California. It's a California project. Um, but I can also, if I look at that through the eyes of somebody that's not, pro labor, somebody who's not, maybe has, some points of contention around, other things, they're going to say, why are you bringing your politics into the classroom to try to, indoctrinate
Right.
my kids? And so the teacher might not have even, that could have been the last thing that was on the teacher's mind, right?
Right.
And so I think, this era of, what we're teaching, what we're assigning, how we're, going back to like the writing assignments book, like how we're asking kids to write about things. um, that diagram, it's just a, basically a really fancy
I like the idea of this diagram though as a
diagram that just
practical
looks
tool.
right, but it just looks like, this is like old school PowerPoint. You just put that topic in the middle, and whatever the four angles, what Frank Claggett used to call angles of vision, are, to pull back and look at that, right?
Yeah.
I think, Drew's website, or the kind of his little intro to his weekly English, newsletter, talks about one of the things that he's bringing to it is looking at things through a lens of Christianity.
Yeah.
Great, puts it out there, and that's that would be one of the four lenses or whatever that
Right.
he's bringing to things, or that somebody else might bring to things. Obviously, a lot of teachers are bringing in a social justice or equity lens to these things. I think the question becomes, where to go with that and how to handle that.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that diagnostic tool though that you introduced to the Idaho teachers as just at least it's a way of what we said before. Understanding context and anticipating potential consequences. That's a really practical thing that you can think through those four different lenses for just coming into these types of potentially charged curricular pieces or texts or whatever with at least your eyes open.
Well, you're
Um,
you're the one who's in Michigan, right? So you look at, like as a social studies teacher, um, who was somebody came up with a book in the last 6 months, I think, that retraced the militia movement in the states back to was it Terry Nichols, the Oklahoma bomber, Timothy McVeigh, and he was trying to make the argument that um, aspects of what happened on January 6th can be traced all the way back. I think largely into parts of Michigan where you had
oh,
uh, militia movement. So
sure.
as a social studies teacher, I can imagine moments in your curriculum where like opportunity to make an interesting connection. Maybe not.
Maybe
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 not.
I won't.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
not. I don't want the militia
Yeah.
guy
Yeah.
running
I
me over
mean,
when I go out at the end of the day.
yeah. Right. Right.
Uh,
I
but
I
to be
think
aware, of those things, right? So
well,
it's
and thanks to social media, I think that the reality is that all of our classes probably, um, or at least most of the teachers that I meet, there are partisan divides right through all these towns and suburbs, and
yeah,
I think the days of assuming that everyone in my class is of a certain persuasion are, I mean, they're definitely well behind me. Um, even in my small town of Michigan, there are parents, families with all different types of beliefs um,
right.
and
Well,
political views.
I was fly fishing, just this last weekend up in the very northern part of California, and if you once you get up to those parts to a place like Redding, and then you go up over to
Sure.
Weaverville, and you kind of that whole area, then you go up into southern Oregon, you start seeing these signs about the state of Jefferson, which when you look into it, like I'll look at the signs, I'll go like, I'm not sure if they're thinking that I'm like their audience for that. And so if you go to like soj51.org, I think it is, and you look it up, uh, these are, and I get it, like these are a large group of people in far northern California, southern Oregon, over into Idaho, maybe Utah, who like SOJ is the 51 is the 51st state. Like they feel like they have zero political representation,
Mm,
um, because they're so remote, and their elected officials, do not have
right.
a voice at the table. And so it's a and if you go up to those areas, and you're in those towns, I understand why people feel that way.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the fly shop was the only shop that was open for business in this town that I stopped in. Every basically every other shop in the town was shuttered. So
And I think that kind of connects with that idea that you said of empathic design. When we approach these difficult topics, are we really approaching it with a position of empathy for all the kids and all the different views in the room? And um, speaking of empathy, I see a comment from someone familiar to me, someone from New Buffalo, Michigan, Chris Totsky, and she's saying that it was funner to teach in 1999, in
New
in the
Buffalo,
sense of
people
of it
left
being.
Buffalo, New York, and migrated to Michigan to have a new Buffalo.
Yeah, well, New Buffalo is a nice little spot on Lake Michigan. So if you're ever driving through, Jim, definitely recommend New Buffalo. Yeah, this observation Chris is making, um, that it feels like some of the life has been sucked out of teaching because of all the obsession with standardized testing and data. How did you? I mean, you weathered that full change that she's describing. You started teaching before No Child Left Behind, and then saw all the iterations of um, testing and standards that have come since. So how did you stay moralized in watching these big shifts in the United States educational policy?
Well, one of the things I don't have some big shiny bright answer about it, but one of the things, like I got some flack, from some colleagues in one place or another, uh, as if I was selling out when I came out with the Common Core companion books.
Yeah,
Um, but my attitude was, well, one, a lot of those people tend to not to be in the classroom as teachers at that point. Um, but was like, look, this is like, basically my employer is expecting us to, work with these standards, and so the Common Core companion, I actually wrote it for myself first. I didn't write it as a
right.
book.
Yeah, that's
Um,
another one of those.
yeah, so I was trying to figure out, okay, what are these things actually saying? So part of what I was trying to do was, you have those like parallel translations of the Bible and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. That
and
is a lot what the Common Core companions like.
Right. I'm not saying it's a Bible, but like I wanted to translate it into language that I understood, and then
Yeah, exactly.
provide a foundation for, okay, well, what would it look like? What could you do? So kind of try to find ways to co-opt it to my own ends, of the kind of teacher that I wanted to be. Um, I did a lot of work for the College Board for a lot of years. One foot was always kind of out the door, in case they went in directions that I really, couldn't support. Um, so during that time there, like I wasn't involved in, what was that whole program that they had? I'm spacing on its name, um, but they had a program where every page was, like you wouldn't need to know anything to be a teacher. You could just tell them
Okay. Yeah.
to do what was on that page. um, and they were basically kind of workbooky things. You had little fragments of literature, to kind of teach the skills, not teach the literature. Um, so do I know there's schools out there, there are departments out there that are, under a lot of pressure, to, as somebody once said, my principal says when he walks by Dave Stewart's room, he wants to hear Jim Burke finishing the sentence that he heard Dave Stewart starting, you know, uh, you know, halfway down the hall. That's not, to use Chris's work, that's not a very fun way of thinking about
No,
teaching.
no.
Um, so, you know, so I tended to gravitate towards the classes where I would have, um, greater freedom. So for years I taught, like that freshman integrated social studies, because we just kind of had our own space,
Yeah,
uh,
right.
and Frank and I, taught all of them. It was like four sections, and so that gave us a lot of creative space, that others didn't necessarily have. I tended to, like, I've written about some of this in books like Accessing School, where I created programs for kids that, not unlike myself when I was younger, who didn't really know how to do school, where there was no curriculum, like they weren't straight up English classes. So I had space in there. Um, when I taught, I taught AP Lit for a long time, and so that, you kind of have, in most cases, a degree of liberty,
Right.
freedom in there. And then, you know sometimes it's, I guess I'm thinking more in terms of the standards right now, but sometimes as long as you can say like, look, here's the five things that I'm working on. I think as long as you can kind of provide some evidence and support for the fact that you're working in those directions. Um, but I also, I definitely know that there's schools. I mean, there's schools where teachers aren't the ones who are even free to create their own curriculum. I
Uh,
wouldn't I wouldn't I wouldn't be able to teach in those schools.
yeah, yeah, I know. I, I definitely feel the pain when people write in that they've got a straight up script that they need to read from, and I don't know that I could have a bunch of longevity in that type of situation.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, I will say to Chris's point about fun, like, and I just mean this, you know, so deeply. Uh, I loved the work, up until the very end, and on some level, um, there's always a way uh, to make parts of it your own. Maybe not all there's ways to slip in things, around the edges. Sometimes, I did a lot of stuff with poetry over the years and whatnot. Um, but whatever it is, there needs to be a way for you to find um, that joy, and a lot of that goes back to the relationships with the kids. Um,
right.
to be able to have that, I think, to err in the direction of an engagement. There's a book called Tuned In and Fired Up by a guy named
Hmm.
Sam Intrater, um, who sat in the back of my class years ago. Actually, the year I was writing English Teacher's Companion, and Sam sat in the back for a whole year and studied my class. Uh,
Oh yeah, yeah,
he was doing his PhD at Stanford, and so he studied my class to look for moments of engagement. He's a great guy. We each had three kids. We were each young dads, and so we could kind of have dad conversations on the side while we were talking about this other stuff. And his whole investigation was to take Csikszentmihalyi's work of flow and basically sit in the back of my class. It was a junior class, wonderful class, and um, and look for moments when either like everybody in a conspicuous way seemed to engage, or when some subgroup. So like, whoa, all the boys were like totally engaged around that when they in a way they aren't usually, or
sure.
if some individual who never engaged suddenly like jumped up and looked into that, and then he would interview them across the way, right? And so what he found was that there was often this moment that I would create, not always, I guess, deliberately, where like this window would open up, where the kids would like basically say like, I totally want to talk about that, and it wasn't what was on my lesson plan, like for the time, like for the
Yeah.
period. um and he said he could see me standing there like kind of like at this crossroads, like, do the lesson plan that I wrote, or here's this thing. And so sometimes I might say like, okay, we'll have that conversation tomorrow. I've got these other things that we're going to do today that I need to do. But there was a sense of being, kind of negotiating, like kind of
Yeah.
working together with each other. um, and my favorite comment about my teaching, which I think I included in that English Journal article. He's interviewing some kid who's talking to him about like the way I talk about reading in the class, or how they work with reading, and the kid says, kind of with a tone of begrudging respect, the kid says, "It's so weird. Mr. Burke talks about all this stuff like it
Yeah.
really matters." So I'll take that on my tombstone.
Yeah.
um,
Right.
not to give the impression that I'm trying to dance around Chris's question. I think the reason why there's not an easy, nice, neat, between the eyes answer to the question is the context in which we work, whether it's your department, or whether it's your school, um, is just so it can vary so much. And so you look for the variables over which you have, some control. What I can tell you is that a teacher that, talks about their work the way you do, and your comment there, Chris, uh, is a teacher that should, really look for the ways that are going to allow you to kind of, resuscitate the love that you feel for the work.
Mm,
I mentioned earlier on. I mentioned Don Graves' book, The Energy to Teach. I
that's
love that
right.
book. And Don Graves, if you don't know him, you should learn who he is. But Don Graves was a wonderful friend and a mentor of mine, and he did this study that he wrote into a book called The Energy to Teach, and I recommend this to everybody. It was a
You do.
transformative. I do, because it was a transformative experience. So what he did is he asked people that were in the study to just keep a little notepad, or like some index cards, and to write down over the course of a week everything you did, and then put a TE for it took energy, a GE for it gave me energy, or N for neutral. So, like Dave and I had a conversation the other night for a while about this. So I would have said, 7 to 8 o'clock, conversation with Dave Stewart, GE gave me energy. Um, and then at the end of the week, he went through, and he wanted me to, he'd say, like, so on Monday from 3 to 3:30, you worked after school with a kid on his paper for your freshman class, and you said GE, it gave you energy. And he says, and then on Tuesday from 3 to 3:30, you worked with another kid on the same paper, different kid, and you said, it took energy. What was the difference? And I said, well, the kid on Monday, wanted to become a better writer. The kid on Tuesday, basically everything that we talked about, he said, if I do that, would it be an A? If I do that, would it be an A? And, like,
Yeah, that'll
I,
do it.
I don't even want to have that conversation with that kid.
Right.
And so that, you know, like, meetings were the kind of universally the most energy sucking thing. But, like, I talked about the fact that I tended to bring the New Yorker. This is in, like, pre cell phone, smartphone
Right.
days. But that I'd bring the New Yorker, for example, to faculty meetings, and the nice 2.5-inch column kind of works well to subtly poke out from behind the meeting agenda, and I could read an article in the New Yorker, um, and pretend like I was interested in the meeting, and not let it suck my soul out of my body. So I think that those things, my kids were really young at that time. We're going to baseball games after school. Uh, to be aware of the things that take your energy, is to be aware of the things that you can look to either not, you know, uh, not get involved in, or the
Yeah.
things that are giving you energy, to say, like, you know what, I have a lot more energy, feel a lot better about things if I get some hour to myself every day after school, to go for a walk, or sit in a
Right.
cafe and read my own book.
I mean, I've used this
So
advice to gain great clarity on my relationship with leadership roles in my school.
sure.
Department chair, PLC leader. I dabbled in those things for a while, but this advice given to me by you, and reading Don's book after, is really helped me to just have no qualms about saying, yeah, I'll never do that again. Because it just, it's a very important role. I always thank my PLC leader, Scott. I told him just yesterday, we had an in service, and I said, let's give it up for the most longevitous PLC leader in our department's history. Because I'm really glad he does it, because he does a good
Oh,
job.
absolutely.
But I just
I
know,
mean,
for
you
me, I've done it enough to know that all
right.
the prep of that is not interesting to me. The extra meetings you have to go to, to look at, and
Sure.
and those meetings tend to be more data, like Chris is talking about. And I know for myself that man, a staff meeting that's typically going to suck the soul right out of my body, as you said, is one where we're going to look at a bunch of data where I just have a million questions that'll never get answered.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so to me, that is super super te, big time
Right.
te.
Right.
Um, I got one more question I got to ask you. How did I you mentioned the end a little bit ago, the decision to retire. I'm working on a piece right now. I don't know if it's what shape it's going to take, but I've just been fascinated by this, by Bill Watterson's career lately. My kids are obsessed. This is probably the best gift may have ever given as a dad is these paperback copies of Calvin and Hobbes.
Uh-huh.
Um, and my kids are all reading them different ways. Dean looks at the pictures. Laura likes the adult humor. But
Sure.
Bill Watterson's amazing because he decides at a point where he could keep doing this forever if he wanted to. He could make $1 bajillion. You and I don't have the $1 bajillion thing, but realistically, you could have kept teaching, been in that role as long as you want. But you made a decision, like Watterson made, to retire. How did you know it was time?
Well, um, one of the quotes that I picked up towards the end that I really liked was from my previous principal. He said it's always better to leave when you're not sure if you should than to
Mm.
stay around and wait until everybody else is sure that you should have.
I like
So
that.
I think there's some wisdom in that. Um, I'll be 62 next month, um, and so 5 years ago, um, I caught a little cancer, and thankfully, very very detected it very early in the spring, and went through it and dodged that bullet. Um, you know, Same kind of cancer that uh, other highly respected authors in the field
Hmm.
have had, and not all of them have survived it. And so I was very grateful for that. I think you know, I caught it at the same age that my dad died from cancer,
Mm.
different kind of cancer. So I was seeing like, oh, okay, I guess the Burke men only get to go to 56. Um, so I was very grateful for getting past that, and I think
Yeah.
a moment like that makes you realize, like, okay, so what's most important. um, and so I applied that next year for the position at middle college because I thought that would present me with a number of. So middle college program, without going into it too much, is a high school program from our public high school district that's located on a 2-year college campus.
Hmm.
So my life changed so much, at the 2-year college, and so I thought there was a nice symmetry to going up and working in that program. Um, 3 English teachers, 3 social studies teachers. That's the entire faculty. Um, so it gave me new challenges. It gave me new things to work with. But then halfway through the first year, this little COVID thing came into town,
Yeah.
uh, and so the experience that I had up there, I think largely because of COVID, was pretty intense. Like we had to be online at middle college for the entire year because they closed the college campus, and that was where our school was located. So I lived talking to people like
Right.
this for a year, and that was definitely not an energy giving situation. Um, and so I felt like uh, I still loved the work, um, but it definitely had taken a toll on me. And I also
Yeah.
wrote 3 books during that time, and so I wasn't relaxing. Um, and I wanted to leave while I still loved it because it's just been such a wonderful part of my life, that the idea of running myself into the ground, and then leaving, kind of spent, Um, so I left it, and then the
Yeah.
idea was just focus on my writing, and I've got plenty of plenty of writing projects lined up. That I worked all day on today,
Yeah.
and so we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a good, and I've noticed this with other people that I dearly respect that have worked these, you know, gargantuan length careers as you have, and retiring is rarely stopping. At this point, it's kind of in you, and just like when we began our talk tonight, um, you talking about how just even you enjoy, like, you doing your substitute teaching work this year is just kind of reminded you of how much you genuinely like working with this age of kids. Um, so
It's the set of It's the set of, like, not to reduce them to problems, but, like, it's the set of problems that I find most fascinating, and want to spend my life thinking about. For
yeah,
years, I've always told my kids that your job is to find a problem or a question that you just think is so fascinating that you would want to spend the rest of your life trying to contribute
yeah,
to the solution of it, or trying to answer it, even though you would know you couldn't solve it because it's just too big, and that would be fine. And I think for me, it goes back to your initial questions about my origins, right? Like,
yeah,
how do we light these fires? I mean, that's what your latest book is all
right,
about. um, Keep them lit, help them find their way to the things um, that they want to investigate. My last semester, my classes, the overarching question that we were trying to answer was, how do we become who we are?
mm,
Um, and it at first it seems like a question that somehow asked the wrong way, but you know there's this process of discovering, like, how did I know that I was a teacher?
right,
uh, I I used to go play the national hardcourt championship tennis tournament that shares the parking lot. The club shares the parking lot with Burlingame High School, and if you'd walked up to me and said, you before you go in to play your match, that school over there, like, you're going to actually become an English teacher and spend your entire adult life in there as a English teacher, I would have, like, the strings on my rackets would have spontaneously broken out of the absurdity of that idea, because I didn't know, who I was, or
right,
why I was. So
yeah,
anyway, it's been a total pleasure. Uh,
absolutely, Jim, absolutely.
Effortless to
Thank you.
talk this long. We could go for 2 more hours, I'm sure.
Yeah, we could. We might end up with our brains dribbling out of our ears by the end, but we definitely could.
Yeah.
Well, I encourage folks who watch this or are watching after to come to NCTE in Columbus, and you can see Jim and I and Tom Hanks.
Well, and if you are here, then you know Dave's work, and his blog and newsletter and all that kind of stuff. But I'm genuinely grateful for his friendship, but I'm
Likewise.
profoundly grateful for people like Dave and people like Drew. Um,
Yeah.
kind of like you. There was a time when I started writing where people like Nancy Atwell and Regie Routman and Don Graves and these others were looking over their shoulder, wondering where the next generation of writers and thinkers about the field were going to come from. And
Right.
so, it's been a hard question to answer, for a while, and now I feel like that question is really being answered very nicely by
Mm.
people like you and Drew, Kimberly Parker,
Yeah.
the women that are putting together Disrupt Texts. Like, there's the new generation of leaders are certainly picking it up, and giving us much to think about and to do.
Mm.
So anyway, thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate you, And take care of yourself. Have a good rest of your evening. Us on the East Coast, we're about to go to bed.
Yeah. Have a nice day at school tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I will. All right. Good night, Jim.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.